I'm Muhammad Kamal. I like to welcome all of you on behalf of Asia Institute. And I like to welcome especially our guest speaker today, Jane Clark. And we are happy to have her today to talk about a very interesting topic, which is very good for this weather. It's raining outside, very wet. Yeah. And this is our second event organized with Beshara Committee in Australia. The first event we had last year in November, and this is our second event. And in fact, the first event was with Beshara and Ibn Arabi in Melbourne. And I like to thank all of you for coming. And I request Dr. Anne-Marie Morrissey to introduce our guest speaker.
Welcome everybody. On behalf of Beshara Australia, I'm very happy to introduce Jane Clark today. And I think Jane has very recently arrived from the UK the last couple of days, isn't it?
Yes.
Last couple of days. So for the last 20 years, Jane has been researching, translating and teaching on the works of Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. She's a senior research fellow for the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society. She has taught lectures and coordinated courses for Oxford University's Department of Continuing Education, the Temenos Academy and the Beshara Trust in the United Kingdom, and also in Spain, Syria, Egypt and the United States. Her papers and publications include, and I'll get the details right, Mystical Perception and Beauty, Ibn Arabi's Preface to the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, Establishing Ibn Arabi's Heritage, First Findings from the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society Archiving Project with Stephen Hertenstein, and the Preface to the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, a provisional translation based upon the text by R.A. Nicholson. So I'll now hand over to Jane.
Okay. Hello. I'm a bit worried about you hearing. Can you hear me at the back? My voice is not very strong, so let me know if you can't hear me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And my thanks to Beshara Australia for bringing me out here. And so my title today is Learning from the Natural World. And I suddenly realised that I've assumed that everyone knows who Ibn Arabi is. I haven't done an introduction. You can ask me afterwards, but fundamentally, one of the most important, influential thinkers in the Islamic tradition, and especially in the Islamic mystical tradition, 1165 to 1240. So we're talking about a 13th century thinker. And I hope I'll show you that his ideas are really startlingly modern and have a great deal to tell us in the present day still. I think we have no problem these days recognizing that we have things to learn from the natural world and that contact with other realms of beings on the planet is very beneficial for us. You know, as a first-time visitor to this country, about to do a bit of travelling, and what I want to do most of all is to head north to see the Great Barrier Reef and the outback and all the natural beauties that you have in this country. And we know so much more about what goes on in these places through scientific research. And ever since Walt Disney first made, The Living Desert in 1953, we have demonstrated a seemingly sort of insatiable appetite for films and TV series which bring out this new knowledge to a general public. So series like What Happens Here, but series like The Blue Planet draw huge audiences in the UK. And we all cancel our Sunday evenings and sit riveted to the television to find out what's happening in the depths of our oceans or on the tops of our highest mountains. So, given all this, what can someone like Ibn Arabi add to our knowledge? My answer is that he has a different perspective from the scientists or from the artists, in that he is concerned with the spiritual status of the non-human creatures who live beside us. And he shows us how they can, and in fact how they are longing to inform us about our own spiritual state and help us on the path of realization. And this is actually a huge theme within Ibn Arabi's work, but as far as I know, only 3 papers have as yet been written on the subject. So there's Pasha Khan's paper, which focuses mostly on the treatment of minerals, plants and elements in Fusus al-Hikam. There's William Chittick, Wisdom of the Animals, which concentrates on 2 chapters in Futuhat al-Makkiyah, on what he calls the dumb beasts, the Baha'im. And then there's Pierre Lorry's excellent overview, which is on the difference between human and animal realms. And so I'm indebted to all of these papers for opening up this extremely interesting subject. In this talk, I'm going to be able to look only at a tiny portion of what Ibn Arabi says, and I'm going to be concentrating mostly on al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, one of his great magnus opus, the Meccan Revelations, and on another major work which has not been very much translated into English, called the Ruh al-Quds fil Munasahat al-Nafs, the Holy Spirit in the Counselling of the Soul, which is a midlife work written in Mecca in about 1200, so some 30 years before his mature expression in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. And this is Ibn Arabi's first major didactic work, his first major teaching text, and in it he basically presents his credentials as a spiritual master, and he gives an account of the 70 or so spiritual masters that he studied with in Andalusia before he moved east to Mecca. Many people might be familiar with this. It has been published as a little book called Sufis of Andalusia. In the 4th section of the book, he extends his list of masters beyond the human realm, and he says, as for the animals, we also had sheikhs amongst them. Among the group of our masters from whom I found support, there was a horse, whose worship was wonderful, the falcon, the cat, the dog, the cheetah, the bee, and others. And in the same passage, he goes even further, indicating that he even found spiritual guidance from so-called inanimate things. There was a gutter spout which I saw in the wall in the city of Fez. It poured water off the terrace like the gutter of the Kaaba. I had notice of its worship when I tried to make myself capable of doing the same. There was also my shadow, which stretches away from my body. From it I learnt the 2 forms of worship which his soul was practicing, and others similar to this. So the focus of this talk is to give some background so that we can appreciate the background to what he's saying here and what wisdom might be imparted by these non-human realms of being. And what I hope to show is that why it seems initially that some of the things that Ibn Arabi says are rather startling. There's actually nothing in his work which cannot be found within the conventional Islamic understandings within Quran and Hadith, or indeed within the understandings of the other mystical traditions of the world. So first, one of the most important Quranic verses within the Islamic Sufi tradition is this Quran 41:53. Soon we will show them our signs to the horizons and in themselves, until it is clear that it is the real, that it is all the real. And this can sometimes be interpreted rather literally, and so, as you probably know, there are great flurries of excitement on the internet when someone finds an apple whose seeds seem to spell out the name Allah or something like this. But for the Sufi mystics, it is an intrinsic part of the spiritual path to understand that everything in the world is a manifestation of the real, according to the well-known principle expressed by Ibn Arabi. I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. Therefore, I created the world that I might be known. So for the Sufis, the world, What we see in the horizons outside of ourselves is not just a collection of separate physical entities which are interacting according to natural laws, but it is a place of signs and symbols which are imbued with meaning, which indicate their origin, which is the one reality. Similarly, our interior life is also seen to be a place of revelation, and thus the quest for self-knowledge is the preeminent discipline within Sufism, which developed quite early on a highly sophisticated spiritual science of state, hal, in which the aspirant comes to understand how the real appears within their own selves and guards against falsehood, by which is meant false attribution of actions, words or thoughts to oneself. This understanding of the world as a place of manifestation of one reality does not mean that there are no distinctions made between the different types of being in the world or between different individual members. The one reality has many different attributes, expressed metaphysically within Islamic philosophy as the divine names, which are multiple, in fact infinite in Ibn Arabi's view, which manifest in various ways and in various degrees. Thus, although we might say that knowledge is seen as a universal human attribute, without doubt some people manifest it more completely than others. And a quality such as self-will is manifested in different degrees throughout the realms of existence. It does not appear very much at all, for instance, at the level of the minerals, while human beings and animals have it in abundance. The conception of the different realms of Islamic cosmology was very much based upon the ancient Aristotelian categories, which have also been the basis of Western science. These are placed in a very different hierarchy, meaning that some are regarded as lower or inferior to others. So at the bottom we have the minerals, which are seen as passive, inert and permanent, plants, which are characterized by growth and movement, animals, which have growth, movement, plus self-will and the capacity for independent movement, and human beings, which have all that the other realms have, plus the capacity for intellect and speech. And then above them are the angels, who are regarded as pure intellect. Within the Islamic schema, based upon the Qur'anic revelation, the hierarchy is slightly different. So we have minerals, plants, animals, but then the angels, and at the very top, the human being. And the characteristic of the human being in the Quranic view is that the human being is characterized by integrating all the degrees of the other realms. So whilst every created being is without a doubt a manifestation of the real, minerals, plants and animals manifest only certain of the divine names, whilst the angels manifest only the names of transcendence. But the human being is seen as the place of expression of all the divine names. And it is this, rather than intellect alone, a property which in any case we share with the angels, which places them at the top of the cosmic hierarchy. In chapter 198 of Futuhat, which we will look at in more detail later on, he talks about the human being as being under the name al-Jami, the one who integrates or collects together. He said, God gathered the emergence of the body of Adam, who was the first human being, the archetypal human being, between his two hands, and he endowed this emergence with all the realities of the universe and revealed to it all his names, so it received both the divine form and the form of the created world. And by virtue of this inclusive nature, human beings are given the role of vicegerent, ruling the world as God's agent. So this follows the Quranic principle found in the Quran, but also in other Semitic traditions, that we have been given dominance over the other created realms. He made it, this is on Adam, spirit for the universe, and he made the different species of the universe to be as the limbs of the body are for the spirit which governs them. And then from this, Quran 45:13, God has subjected to you all that is in the heavens and the earth, which is all from him. And we're all familiar with this because it is the very basis on which we operate in the world today, the basis on which we feel that we can farm animals, we control animals, we look after animals, etc., etc., because of this understanding that we are given this right of rulership over the other realms. And in one way, this is totally endorsed by Ibn Arabi, as I'm quoting from him. However, he also brings in other dimensions which radically subvert the standard hierarchy as I've just laid it out. So the first one, we're going to look at a couple of ways in which he subverts this. And the first one is the distinction between animate and inanimate realms. So, in our ordinary classification, we make quite a sharp distinction between what we would regard as alive and what we regard as non-alive. So when we are trying to decide whether there's life on Mars, for instance, we have nowadays a whole list of characteristics of what we would say was a rock and what we would say was life. And there is much debate about what category we might put something like a virus in, or in a debate that's going to come upon us in an increasingly pressing way, what category are we going to put intelligent robots into? So this distinction between animate and inanimate levels is very important. But Ibn Arabi maintains that the divine name al-Hayy, the living, is an essential attribute of God, and therefore it's manifested in all beings, including the so-called inanimate realm. And similarly, with other essential leader names, like the speaker and the knower. So, in chapter 198 of the Futuhat, he says, no, this is 378. In our view, the real created everything in the world, even though the speculative thinkers and the common people say that it is not alive and it is not an animal, in such a way that it recognizes him and knows him, and it is alive, speaking of him with praise. This is perceived by the believers due to their faith, and by the people of insight, ahl kashf, because they see it with their own eyes. So just to unpack this a little bit, there are several names used for animals within Ibn Arabi's text. One of them, we've mentioned the bahima, which means the beasts, or as Chittick translates it as the dumb beasts. So these are generally speaking mammals, four-legged animals like horses or donkeys. And then there's another word, dabba, meaning a moving thing. So this is related to the things that sort of crawl on the ground. And then there's this more general word, hayawan, which is from the same root as high, which more generally just means living things. And in this sense, as we've just seen, this word hayawan, normally translated as animals, for Ibn Arabi applies to all realms of existence. So we see already a kind of merging of the categories here. Ibn Arabi specifies two types of people who have knowledge of this aliveness of all things. And one of them is the believers, because this understanding is laid out in the Quran and the Hadith tradition. And so it is accepted by believers as a matter of faith, even if they don't see the truth of it for themselves. Ibn Arabi cites many examples from the scriptures to support his view. So he says in Ruh, in our view, the minerals and the stones are contrary to how most people see them. As God says, from among the rocks there are some from which rivers gush forth, and some from which, when split, water gushes forth, and there are some which sink because of their fear of God. So they are described by having fear of God and other things. He also said, if we had revealed this Quran to a mountain, it would have seen it humble itself and crack because of the fear of God. And this is from the Hadith tradition, and the Prophet salam alayhum, said, I knew a stone and it greeted me. And he said in Uhud, this mountain loves us and we love it. So here we see that he is using the Quran to show that these inanimate things are in fact have the characteristics which we would normally think of as living. And the other group of people are the Ahl Kashf, by which we mean people within the Sufi tradition, or perhaps maybe a specific group from amongst them. Kashf is quite a specific term. It's often translated as insight, but it literally means uncovering or unveiling. And it refers to the removal of the veil of ignorance so that we see the reality of things. Kashf is a sudden brief experience, like the curtain lifting so that you see the truth of what's going on behind the facade. And so the use of this word akhla kashf emphasizes that the hiddenness of the aliveness of all things is a natural one, and that it is a special grace from God, a special esoteric knowledge to be given to witness what they really are alive. It is not an ordinary knowledge which can be gained by common sensory perception or by intellectual thought, meaning, therefore, by science, but one which comes through what Ibn Arabi calls the private face, the wajh al-has. And so there are lots of Sufi stories about the lifting of this veil. A lovely one about the great Akbari and Saint Aziz Mahmud Hudai, who was a great follower of Ibn Arabi and head of the Jalbeti order in Turkey, who when he was a disciple was when set out with a group of others to pick flowers for the tekke. And at the end of the day, he alone returned empty-handed. And when asked why, he replied, I could not find a single one that was not in prayer. So here we meet one of the great characteristics of the non-human realms, that they are constantly praising and adoring God. In the quote we've just seen, Ibn Arabi uses the word tasbih from the root sabaha, meaning to praise or glorify. We say, Subhanallahi, glory to God. This is the root that he's using. This is not hamd, which is a phrase for the essential worship. It is only, so for Ibn Arabi, it is only human beings who have been given the gift of intellect and have become dominated by it, who are not in constant praise and glorification of God. We have the capacity of denial and forgetfulness of our origin, whereas everything else remembers. And so this is one of the main things for Ibn Arabi, that these non-human realms can teach us how to praise God properly. As for maintaining that all realms of creation have speech, William Chittick's pointed out that Ibn Arabi understands this actually in a pretty literal way. He does not mean that things have a kind of speak in a metaphorical way by the way that they move or what we can see. But following again, he means that these actually have the capacity to speak. And he uses the verb natika, which is normally associated exclusively with human speech. And the most famous line from Quran here is probably Solomon. Solomon was David's heir, and he said, O mankind, I have been taught the speech of the birds, mantik al-taya. And this, as many people will know, inspired one of the great mystical poems of Islam, written by Farid al-Atta, who was a contemporary of Ibn Arabi, which is often given in the title in the English, The Conference of the Birds. But it is literally the speech from this root natika. And this speech is often associated with reason. The nafs and natika in Arabic philosophy is another word for the logos. And mantika actually means logic. But in the case of the hayawan, as we'll come to, they perceive things without the intermediary of the intellect. That is their characteristic, as Ibn Arabi explains in the passage that are going to come. So Ibn Arabi says on this thing of speech, from Ru, we regard the minerals as knowing God and of speaking about him in their own world in accordance with their horizon and their sphere. They also have a herald from amongst their genus, meaning a prophet. and they are, in our opinion, one of the communities of God. And so here he uses this word ummah, and is perhaps initially one of Ibn Arabi's more startling ideas, that it's not only human beings who are sent prophets, or in fact can take on a prophetic function. So this is ummah is used for the community of Islamic believers, and but he has support in the Quran. This famous passage, "And your Lord gave inspiration to the bees, saying, take for yourself houses in the mountains and the trees and in what men build, then eat of all the fruits and follow the ways of your Lord, which will be easy." So he depicts these bees as being given a divine order, which they are then obliged to follow, just as a human community is given a divine order through a prophet. What is more, Ibn Arabi implies in some places that the animals can even be prophets to us, take on a prophetic function towards us. This is from Futuhat, and he says in this way station, this is from the Manzil section of the Futuhat, is found the knowledge of the messages scattered through the cosmos. Nothing walks in the cosmos without walking as a messenger with a message. This is an elevated knowledge. Even worms in their movement are rushing with a message to those who understand it. And the word here, Rasul, is the same word we talk about the Prophet Muhammad Rasulullah. Yeah? So here we have a much more active interpretation of what this thing about signs of the horizon mean. We might have had the impression that this looking at the signs in the horizon was a matter of being observers in the world, sort of watching what is happening outside of us, ourselves and interpreting it. But Ibn Arabi presents us with a much more vigorous and technicolor world where these non-human teachers are actively approaching us, rushing towards us, longing to bring us news of the divine. And as Ibn Arabi describes in the first passage in the Ruh, actively educating us. And so one thing to mention at this point probably is the importance of this contact with the natural world for the Sufi practitioners. It's always good to remember, despite his great contribution to the metaphysical side of the tradition, that someone like Ibn Arabi was also a practicing seeker who undertook the disciplines and practices of the Sufi path. And this tended to bring people into an unusual degree of contact with the other realms of creation. Most seekers would undertake long periods of retreat where they would withdraw either from human society, often into wild places like caves or forests. Ibn Arabi himself did this, and in his youth spent a long period of retreat in a graveyard in Andalusia. And anyone who has spent time in solitary retreat will know how much we begin to notice these other realms when there are no other human beings around to distract us. In fact, one of the interesting consequences of coming to understand the real nature of these realms is that total solitude actually becomes impossible, because one is always without escape in the presence of one or other of them. And even if one achieves the most extreme form of seclusion, one is inevitably in contact with the animal, which is one's own body, and which is, according to the Quran, has its own spiritual life. And so this relationship with animals forged in retreat is a very, very strong feature of all mystical and spiritual traditions. So here, there's nothing of Ibn Arabi, by the way, but this is one of the great Turkish saints, Hacı Bektaş, who is always portrayed with a deer and a lion who came to him in the retreat. This is the great Buddhist saint Milarepa, and at the bottom you will see again the lion and the deer. And here, a bit faded, it's light really, this is St. Giles of the Christian tradition, who was famous for his relationship with the deer, which, as you can see, is actively embracing him in this wonderful portrait. As for the inanimate world, this is the ashram of Ramana Maharshi in southern India, and behind is the sacred mountain, Arunachala, which is where Ramana Maharshi gained enlightenment. And you can walk up from the back of the ashram to the little retreat house that he spent time in. And Ramana Maharshi is really quite explicit that he was taught by the mountain. And the people in the Ramana Maharshi ashram now will talk about the mountain as being their teacher in a quite specific way. And of course, I don't have to tell you about sacred mountains, because you have one of the most famous sacred mountains in the world, in the heart of your country. And then there's this. And this is the sacred precinct in Mecca. It is a 15th century engraving, so it's a few centuries after Ibn Arabi. It's very different from how it was today, how it is today. Very similar, I suspect, to how it was in Ibn Arabi's time. And here's the sacred precinct, and here's the place the people are circumambulating. And what they're circumambulating is round the Kaaba, and what is at the centre of the Kaaba is a stone. It is the black stone that was brought by Abraham. And so Ibn Arabi gives a vivid example in his own experience in chapter 2 of the Futuhat, where he describes an event which led him to lead one of his works, Taj al-Rizal, which consists of a series of love letters written to the Kaaba. I'm only going to put the last bit of the quote in. This is what he says. The fact was that I considered my constitution to be more excellent than that of the Kaaba and its rank, and that as a place of divine theophany of divine realities, it was inferior to mine. I spoke of it as a mineral constitution on the first level of engendered beings. My conduct was due to a spiritual state which dominated me, and without any shadow of a doubt, God wished to warn me about this state of inebriation. He incited me to arise from my bed one cool night with a full moon and a slight dew. I did my ablutions and went out to accomplish the ritual circuits, profoundly disturbed. It seemed to me that just one other person was carrying out the circuits. I began by kissing the stone and then started to commambulate. Having arrived at the gutter behind the enclosure, I looked at the Kaaba. I then saw it, as perceived in my faculty of imagination, raise the skirts of its rows and maintain itself thus hovering above its foundations. It had the intention of turning me back when I reached the Syrian corner to prevent me from circling round it. It threatened me, using words which my ear could hear. Keep coming on, and we shall see what we will do with you. How you underestimate my value and overestimate that of the sons of Adam, and consider that those who have knowledge are superior to me. By the almighty power of him alone to whom it belongs, I shall not allow you to circle around me. I came back to my senses and realized that God wished to correct me. I thanked him for this, and then the affliction which I had felt vanished. So here, astonishing passage. We see several of the themes that we've already been touching upon. For one thing, we see an example of what it might be, experience of what it might be to hear the speech of an inanimate thing, and we see the Kaaba acting as a prophet or a warner in actually correcting Ibn Arabi's behaviour. And what it corrects him in is actually inverting the standard Aristotelian hierarchy and questioning the Ibn Arabi's assumption that as a human being that he was at the top of the cosmic hierarchy. And it shows us that even in certain respects, even the mineral realm can show itself to be in a high state as. So he refers to himself as being inebriated, meaning sort of drunk with power, sense of power. But in the Ruh al-Quds he uses the term pretension for a state in which we claim a status which we do not really have. And this is because when the texts such as the Quran are referring to the state of the human being, they are referring to the essential human nature, to the al-insān al-kāmal, the complete or realized human being, which is only actualized or realized by those who have achieved this level of perfection. But in fact, most of us have not realized this degree in ourselves, and so we cannot claim it. So this, for Ibn Arabi, our integrating nature is on the one hand the great glory of our humanity, the potential which beckons to us. But on the other hand, it is the great danger which prevents us from realization, because it makes us proud and we attribute to ourselves spiritual states that we don't actually have. So, in chapter 198 of the Futuhat, entitled The Knowledge of the Divine Breath, by which he means the knowledge of the breath of the compassionate, the Nafas ar-Rahman, Ibn Arabi lays out an order of the emergence of all the different realms of creation from the first to the last in terms of the 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet. And this is a kind of famously was drawn out by Titus Burckhardt in a little book called Mystical Astrology as a kind of massive cross-referenced map of Ibn Arabi's symbolic universe. And this is actually not from Mystical Astrology, it's reproduced in Sayyidin Hussein Nasser's Islamic Science, who's redrawn it with slightly different translations. Begins here with the Aleph and goes through all the realms, 28 realms of creation, ending up with the Waw, which is the degrees of the al-insān al-kāmal, through which all the degrees of the universe are elevated and returned to the essential. You can't see it. Here's the relevant section for us. Having talked about the divine breath travelling through all the hidden realms, the realms of the stars, the celestial planets, and then the realms of fire, air, water and earth, he comes here to the realms of the minerals, plants, animals, angels, man, which is what we're talking about today. Each of these correlate a zodiacal sign, a realm of being, a letter of the alphabet, and a divine name. And so here, realm 22, the minerals under the name Al-Aziz, the precious, the dear, or the inaccessible. Realm 23, the plants, Al-Razak, the nourisher, the one, it's an intensive form, the one who constantly nourishes, is always nourishing. 24, the animals, Al-Hayawan, under the name Al-Mudhil, the one who makes low, who abases, who humbles. We're going to skip over the jinn, this thing. And angels, Al-Quwa, the power, the strong. And then, as I've already said, the human being, Al-Jami, the collecting together or the integrator of all the realms that come before. So this, we could spend a lot of time on this diagram, so I'm going to choose just one aspect which is very relevant here, which is in order to, and just to mention that in order to reach this degree of the human being, we have to integrate in ourselves all the degrees that come before us. And this means that we have to integrate within ourselves the names given to the animals, plants and the animals. And I'm going to concentrate on the animals, the Hayawan, which we've already said can extend beyond what we'd normally think of the Hayawan to all living things, including the minerals in certain senses, and the name the Mudhil, which is what William Chittick also concentrates on. So I've chosen it because I think it is above all the characteristic which tells us the most that the animal, this realm of the Hayawan can teach us. Because through it we come to know the attributes of need and dependence which knock us off our pedestal and which we associate with what Ibn Arabi calls ubudiyah, servanthood. And here there is, of course, a link back to the first lesson that we noted the animals can teach us, that of praise, because this root abada can be translated both to serve and to worship. Both meanings imply lowering. Servanthood, because one puts oneself below someone else, puts oneself under their command and puts their needs above one's own. And worship, because it requires lowering, abasement before the grandeur of God. And in all traditions, but in the Islamic tradition above all, we always bow our heads, to the divine. We lower ourselves, and in the Islamic tradition, we actually go all the way down and lower ourselves down to the ground in prostration. So Ibn Arabi says in the book, I think, God says, I created the jinn and the human beings only to worship me. That is, to lower themselves to me, and they will not lower themselves before me until they realize my position and my might. He created them by the name the humbled, because he created them for worship. And here, he created human beings and jinn only to worship or to serve him, but they know this only by instruction from God through the mouth of a prophet, whilst it is in the original nature of animals, fitra. But most people have no insight, and they are blind to them. One of the people of God saw a man riding his donkey, and he was hitting its head to make it walk faster. He said to the man, "Stop hitting the head of your donkey." But the donkey said to him, "Let him be. He is hitting his own head." This donkey, by his essential nature, not by thought, had knowledge of what state the man would end up in. So observe, you people who are veiled, how your degree compares to the degree of the beasts. The beasts know you, and they know what state you end up in, and know that for which you were created. But you are ignorant of all that. So, this matter of the state or the station to which a person will return means, to my knowledge of Ibn Arabi, my interpretation, the state that we will end up in death. After the Day of Judgment, what we're building up for ourselves by our actions in this world. And it's one of the attributes of kashf that it is the uncovering that make us ignorant of the true situation of the soul, what we're actually doing. And this ties in with the idea that we said that when we die, the parts of our animal, which are hayawan, will act as witness of our actions. So you could translate the Wonki's words, I think, because Arabic uses the present tense as the future, and he says, leave him, he will end up hitting his own head in eternity, meaning that this man is sort of accruing, punishment from himself in the afterward. How are we doing for time? Okay. Okay, I haven't got long, but I'd like to read you the cat story, if you can bear a little bit longer of me. So, Ibn Arabi gives a very nice example of this ability, I haven't got it on slide, to discern people's spiritual states in the Ruh al-Quds when talking about one of his early masters, Abu Hajjaj Yusuf al-Shubabuli. He says of him, he had a black cat which nobody could touch or lay a hand upon. It used to sleep in his lap. He used to tell me, this unfriendly behaviour which you see in her is not a total characteristic. God has made her friendly towards the saints. I myself observed several times when I was with him that someone would come in and she would rub her cheek against his foot and welcome him. Then another man would come in and she would flee. When my sheikh came to see him for the first time, I mean Abu Jafar al-Uriyani, who was Ibn Arabi's first sheikh, the cat was in another house, but it left this to have a look at our sheikh. Then, before he could sit down and our sheikh could say sit, she had opened her 2 feet on his neck and embraced him and rubbed against him with her face in his beard. Abu Hajjaj stood up for him until he had seated him but said nothing. Abu Hajjaj told me that he had never seen her act like this with anyone else. She continued to stay with Abu Jafar until he left. So here. So, end game. So to conclude, I want to return to the passage from the Ruh where Ibn Arabi talks about his spiritual masters from the non-human realms. If you remember, he said, there was a gutter sprout which I saw in the wall in the city of Fez. And this one, there was also my shadow which stretches away from my body. From it I learnt the 2 forms of worship which its soul was practicing, and others similar to this. So I just want to say something about these 2 forms of worship. He says, everyone from these communities of minerals, plants and animals has 2 forms of worship. The worship which is general to the community as a whole, and the worship which is particular to each individual of the community. Participating in the worship of the individuals is not demanded of you, but only the worship in which the genus of this community participates. It is only appropriate for you to undertake the worship of the individuals of the community when the real places you in the position to do so, and you do it at that particular time. Well, this is fine to be let off that one, but actually, when we think about it, there are an enormous number of species of minerals, plants and animals, and Ibn Arabi is putting it down by implication that it is an obligation of us to learn and to understand the forms of worship they would, that they would practice. So the 4 points that I wanted to say about this is that one of the aspects of the lowering that these realms actually affect us is that it does give us a taste that actually these realms are offering us an infinity of possible knowledge. We would never come to the end of understanding all of this. No one can know all the worship of all these species distinctively in detail. And so there really is no end to the possibility of our being instructed and our being taught by them. And this is absolutely in line with Ibn Arabi's understanding of ubudiyya, of servanthood, which he says is our most essential characteristic, and that we should never, ever remove ourselves from it, not even when we are granted the very highest levels of knowledge. Because of this knowledge, that the knowledge of this worship and such like is actually infinite, is beyond the capacity of any human being. So no human being could ever claim to know completely the worship of every state, every realm of being. And as for the state, so just to finish, that Ibn Arabi leads us, Ibn Arabi says here, every servant of God is under an obligation in the worship which their reality demand. So you, my friend, as a human being, are under an obligation in your worship by 5 realities. The reality of the angels, for they are within you, the reality of the sentient things, the reality of the plants, the reality of the minerals, and the reality of their combined whole, al-jamia. When you fully perform the gratitude of these realities, and you are supported by them, and you worship God with all the strength that you have been given through unveiling and knowledge of them, then, if you are a true seeker, after this, you will be transported to the first step on the way which has been manifested to you. Okay. Thank you. We've got a bit of time.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and we have now any question you can ask her. And at the same time, we have some simple food.
Okay.
Where are we going to put this in first?
We can put them.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I will be the first one to start.
Okay. So there's someone here. Are you going to mediate? Yes. Yes. You have a question.
Because I will be busy.
Yeah.
So Jane, if you just move around the side and then we'll put the food on.
Okay. Okay. I've skipped. I've rather skipped over the jinn because they are, yes, it seemed too much in the whole thing to do. The jinn are, I mean, they're placed in different places, but they are a spiritual realm, which is normally conceived of as between the human and the angelic realm. And he puts them under the name Latif, meaning the subtle, that you don't see them. So I suppose we'd think, I mean, the jinn feature very, very strongly in the Quran and in traditional stories. We don't know much about them today. But I think we'd think that the mythic stories of fairies, leprechauns, actually the jinn in Arabian Nights and such like, are a reference to this subtle realm of being, which was much more vividly known in the past. Yeah. I actually don't know whether he mentions that. Yeah. No reason why not. Yes.
I'd just like to address his last question. There are jinn teachers, different scholars, Sheikh Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi and many other scholars, they have mentioned the stories, and even there is a proper judiciary system for the jinns as well. The scholars, the people who decide on their issues. So different scholars like Sheikh Ismail, they have extensively written on it. Right?
You had a question? Yes.
I can ask a question. The idea of choice, I'm not sure they're two separate things or you combine them, and going to heaven. Do animals go to heaven? Or does that require their ability to choose? Hence, they have to act appropriately before they can go down that path.
Well, I'm not sure about whether animals you'd talk about animals going to, heaven or hell in the same way that you talk about human beings. But I think the most obvious question to ask about all this, for my mind, is on the one hand, Ibn Arabi says all the animals are in a perfect state of praise. Yes, and they're in this state of knowing. And then at the other side of it, he says that they have a prophet sent to them. So I suppose the obvious thing to ask there is, if they're already in a state we regard as perfect knowing, then what would be the function of that? What would be a function of a prophet sent to? He says that that each of these are communities, and each of them have they like a community of believers, and they have a prophet sent to them. And he says we sent the prophet we gave inspiration to the bees. So, and I suppose I thought about that. And I think that we have this thing that we haven't talked about, because this was a very brief overview. I hope you could follow it. Was it too brief? Was it, it gives you a, there's a lot there that one can unpack. There is this final degree, the Rafi al-Darajat, the human being on this diagram, which is under the letter Wow, which is this is the degree, as the out-breath of the creation, the Nafas ar-Rahman, there's the out-breath of the creation and the emergence of the whole cosmos, in Ibn Arabi's view, in the divine breath, which culminates in the creation of the human being, who is the last creature to emerge. yes? And then there's the degree after that, which is this elevation of degrees. Do you know, so through that, everything is then returned to the origin. So that's, if you like, the in-breath of the whole of creation. And that, I think, this elevation of degrees is something where you could perhaps understand what the state of, that there might be a possibility, say, for an animal, even though it's in the state of perfect praise already, could still be in a higher state. And the fact that he makes a distinction between individuals of the community, which, as far as I know, is unique. You know, lots of the traditions, spiritual traditions, will have an idea. You know, this was it was Aristotle himself and other thinkers have said, and Aquinas. You know, oh yeah, there are spiritual stations of animals, but they're by genus. You know, like an animal, all horses are sort of subsumed under the spiritual status of horses. You know, whereas Ibn Arabi says quite explicitly in this last passage, there are two forms of worship. Each individual horse has a specific form of its own worship. And so there, I think you might be able to see that there are distinctions that we would be very hard to understand through our ordinary intellectual powers about what's going on within these communities, that there are possibilities, that there are distinctions, and maybe a possibility, you know, for an animal in some way to, you know, improve its worship.
Implies they have the choice not to worship.
They don't have the choice not to worship. That's a unique human thing. Yes.
Jane, this is a personal question. What brought you to know about Ibn Arabi? Is it from the academic side that brought you to know about him, or from the spiritual side that brought you to know about him?
Oh, well, I came through it through the Beshara school, and that was through the spiritual side, really. That was my first introduction. And in fact, I studied Ibn Arabi within the Beshara school for about 20 years before I decided that I went to university and learnt Arabic and such like, specifically to read the text in the original. So it was the meaning of it that originally motivated me. Yes.
You said right at the beginning that this philosophy is very relevant to our own time.
Yes.
I mean, one thing I see is that it encourages respect for all levels of being, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
But I wonder if you'd like to expand on how you see it, the relevance to, you know, contemporary life, contemporary society.
Well, yes, I think respect is the thing that one would say. And, you know, we've had, as you probably know, within Western philosophy, you know, within the Descartesian kind of vision, you know, animals and never mind the lower levels of being, you know, are actually regarded as machines, you know, and Descartes actually, you know, really denied even sentience to animals and said that they couldn't experience pain and such like, and you know, I think many of us these days, and you know, would argue against this, and our own experience of many people will argue against this as well. I mean, it's obvious to us that that animals, you know, we have pets, you know, we have all this scientific knowledge now about the way that animals behave and how intelligently they behave. You know, that they aren't just mechanical objects, that and the power of saying that they're mechanical objects is to say that you can do what you want with them because you don't have to worry about their feelings or whatever. And so we have, you know, really horrible mechanization of the food processes and such like, by which we treat, not that animals, you know, is the most vivid, but Ibn Arabi would say we should be thinking about how we treat plants and minerals as well. So, I mean, this is a radical overturning of the kind of commercial way in which, you know, in our sort of political and social way that we treat things, you know. So, I mean, that was fairly obvious, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, as a relevance today, but also, I mean, one of the things that strikes me as well is that all this scientific research and everything that we have is also pointing us towards this kind of perspective. You know, if you watch something like Blue Planet and you see how the coral reefs are working and everything, you know, it's full of, you can't help but wonder at what's happening. Do you know, I mean, amazement. I mean, you know, sort of, wow. Do you know, this is so intricate and wonderful. That's a kind of opening to me, to saying, well, maybe, you know, that's a kind of invitation to take a step back and to actually think, well, you know, if you take this perspective, not just, oh, this is interesting, but, oh, what is this showing me? You know, what's this showing me about myself? What wisdom is being imparted by these creatures?
I mean, it's very relevant to climate change. Practically any of the catastrophes you can think about today that we're organising for ourselves. This philosophy is an antidote towards it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know,
every level, not only the animals, but even the humans and the coal and all the rest of it.
I mean, I think you could see this as a message. You know, from this point of view, I'm sure if Ibn Arabi was saying, he'd say all these problems, climate change and everything, it's a huge message that's being given to us about, not only about what we should be doing economically, but about our spiritual state. You know.
We just got time.
One question. Okay. Yes, question?
Yes,
May I ask? I'm Melbourne Uni graduate education. I've been settled in Melbourne 24 years now. And I think the whole world are very interested to know how come the teaching of the Muslim religion developed, and now there were so many, they call themselves also Muslim, kill people for not believing in the religion. So I think the whole world wants to know how come this teaching developed into like so many terrorism, so many terrorists destroy people's lives in the name of the religion.
Well, all I can say is that, you know, there are many strands to the Islamic tradition, as there are many strands to all the traditions, and this teaching of Ibn Arabi has not developed into that. You know, these people, the terrorists, you know, wherever you find them, one of the first things that they will do is they will burn the books of Ibn Arabi, because within the tradition there are oppositions. And so these people who are taking this very different interpretation of Qur'anic verses, for instance, they are not embracing this. So this is a different strand of the Islamic tradition.
Thank you.